Welcome. I'm Elio from Westeros.org, and this is a quick video. I'm really gonna try and be fast, just to give people something. This is a topic that keeps coming up on the forum, and elsewhere on the web. I've seen lots of discussions about it. It's very nerdy, but it's something that people keep wanting to know about. So I figure I'd give my opinion and give why I think it's this. The topic: the population of the Seven Kingdoms. I laugh because I know that most of you will just stop it, but some of you will be interested in this topic. It's difficult to estimate something that's a fantasy kingdom's population. George really hasn't given a lot of hints or information about it. We have some things that tell us we can't quite compare to the Middle Ages, not very easily. Because certain things about Westeros are not like the Middle Ages we know, especially if you go to the corresponding era around the late 14th century, early 15th century. Westeros is on the whole much less urbanized in terms of cities. George basically says there are 5 cities in Westeros. I mean, if you look at medieval France in the 1400, there were a dozen cities. Now, one thing on the other hand people discount is the fact that there are towns, and not just the towns you see. There are towns in lots of places that aren't ever named, that George just hasn't gone around to name. The best evidence for this is the Arya chapter in the Clash of Kings, where she's traveling with Yoren and company, and she mentions that they are passing multiple towns along the way on the route northward. That's really interesting because that's very suggestive of having a population that is partially urbanized. There's enough urbanization, at least around routes like the King's Road, around major trade routes. I would guess things like the Gold Road. You would expect to see more towns along the rivers of the Riverlands. The Riverlands are a very strange place. The Reach must be chock full of them. The Reach is the most France-like, I think, if you would, in terms of how it would be. So how would we estimate the population? Well, I've seen 3 different ways of doing this. There's possibly 4. I've tried myself these 3 different ways. Now, the very simplest is, there's an old rule of thumb which I think Edward Gibbon, the historian, created back in whenever he did it, which basically claimed that no nation, at least no pre-modern nation, could really sustain more than 1% of its population in their arms, right? Now that's not everyone just picks up their spears and pitchforks and just defends their land, because in theory you could have a lot more. I mean, if you look at the Anglo-Saxons, the third, as they called it, in theory was every able-bodied man, but they never called it. It wasn't possible to sustain it logistically, right? So if you use that, and it's a very ugly rule of thumb, but it seems to very roughly correspond with what we know about this sort of era, the European history, the European-like history or setting. You then go and add up all the troops that have been mentioned for the various sides: the Lannisters, the Starks, the Dornish, the Vale, as hinted at, really, and so on and so forth. And you take information like where George once did a comparison of some of the regions in terms of their military strength. That's in the Sospek Martin collection. And what you come up with, and now this is rough again. These are the figures that some of it can change, and some of it might be inexact, but very broadly, roughly, we have accounted for approximately 400,000 troops. 400,000 troops in the Seven Kingdoms. In the current War of the 5 Kings, have been mobilized in their arms, with the idea being that these are more or less representative of the population base you can keep under arms for a sustained period of time. And if you use that 1% figure, then you would say that would be represent approximately a population of 40 million people, give or take. It's a very rough number, but give or take, I usually say plus minus 5 million. Another way to do it is to apply something called age cohorts. Now, there was a very good study. I think it was Bacharach. I think it was. There's a historian, medieval historian, who my name I'm blanking on, who did a study of the military system during the Carolingian Empire, and he did a really interesting study in which he looked at something called age cohorts, which are grouping the population, or the male population, among age groups, and trying, based on various figures he had for what the Carolingian Empire could manage, applying that and extrapolating it to Westeros. Now, it is a different way of getting at the same thing, and I found that it got you pretty close to that 40 million figure again. If you want a more detailed explanation, I'd have to post that because it's been years since I've done it. But I recall there's a couple of books that are very interesting, just for those who are interested in military history of the Middle Ages, and it provided an idea for how you might be able to use the figures that we have in the books and apply them to, or apply this sort of technique that he developed to try and estimate the military troops. Again, it came out to about 40 million. I thought that was interesting, but it does again depend a little bit on how many troops we have accounted for under arms and extrapolating from that. And then there's the other one, which is an extrapolation, but this one actually looks at the area of the Seven Kingdoms, and we now can do this today. We can really figure out how large our Seven Kingdoms are, thanks to the fact that the wall is approximately 300 miles long, and you can use that as an accurate scale. And very roughly speaking, Westeros has an area of about 3 million or so square miles. Quite large. Not the largest empire or kingdom. Kingdom, I guess it might possibly be one of the largest kingdoms ever, but it wouldn't be the largest empire in our own history. More interesting, however, would be then to try and figure out the square areas of each of the sub-regions of Seven Kingdoms. And then, and this is where you start extrapolating, once you've got that, you start saying, well, the Reach kind of looks a bit like France in its richness and fertility and its population. I mean, it's got a very big population. It's very fertile. It has the largest army, which kind of immediately corresponds to the biggest population. And you kind of say, this area kind of looks like that, and this area kind of looks like that, and you try and get figures that more or less correspond to what sounds right for that population of troops you have, right? I think the Vale, like compared to Germany at some point. Dorne sounded to me, I think when I did the comparison, I think I may have looked at southern Spain in the Middle Ages, or estimates for these sort of things, where it's not as desert, of course. And of course, George, actually, when I first did this, it was years ago, actually, we had the idea that Dorne had 50,000. So I was thinking, well, 50,000 spears, that would, using those cohorts and rules of thumb, you'd look at about 5 million population. And he's sort of cut that by half in the later books, and it turns out the Dornish are misleading people about how strong they are as a technique to avoid getting caught up in things, and that makes sense. The fact that they have, there's so much desert and so on, so it's not a very welcoming, fertile place. So you start doing this, and you start kind of guessing, and I think the Iron Islands, you kind of look at the area of Iceland that was actually populated, or you look at the area of Norway, or you look at the density of population, places like Norway in the Middle Ages, in the areas that were actually inhabited, as opposed to the whole area, because you'd assume a large part of the Iron Islands, especially around the sea, the coastal areas, are inhabited relatively densely. We have a couple of towns. The North has a couple of towns so far as we know, and then it has the White Harbor, there's the Winter Town, and there's I'm blanking at the moment, Barrowton, right? So you use this technique, and you come again, at least I did, and others have done so, to a population of about 40 to 45 million, give or take 5 million. The controversial one for some, and I'm going to discuss this one, is the North. Some want to believe that the North is half or almost half the size of the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. It's not quite true. It's closer from my own calculations. It's when you don't count the area beyond the wall. It's closer to about a third of the size of the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. When you add everything else, there is a difference. I tend to think that the population is about 4 million in the North. Which you would say, oh well, if it's about 1 million square miles, that's a very low population density. That's a population density of about 4 people per square mile, 3.5 people per square mile. Now that does seem very low. If you look at England in the Middle Ages, say, you're looking at even areas that were much less developed would have 10 per mile or even kilometer, which would actually be like something like 15 per square mile. And that's true, but you have to look at the North as it's described in the novels. As I said, we only know of 2 real towns there. Now, I'm sure there's other little towns, just as I said earlier, but it's not a place that's, Robert mentions they travel from Rennek up to Winterfell and they hardly see anyone. Yet Arya, when she's traveling on the Riverlands and along the King's Road, there's multiple towns. It's a much less densely populated place. The Barrowlands are, when we see it described, days and days crossing and they don't see another living soul. It's this big empty plain. The Wolfswood, yeah, people are crawling out of the Wolfswood now, but it's still a densely wooded, forested area. It's not going to have the ability to sustain very dense populations. The mountains where the clans are, yeah, they're spread all over this area, and yet they only provide so much strength. They're just not that populated. To me, a good comparison would be to look at, for example, Scandinavia. Scandinavia is the obvious example. Someone says, oh, well, the North really isn't as far north in the southern parts as Scandinavia is. That may be true, but George pretty much has it that once you cross the Neck, once you leave the Riverlands and you go into the Neck, the population thins out a lot. And there are vast regions that we can see that are quite empty. And now, here's an interesting figure when you talk about the Middle Ages. You can look at Norway, and for example, very funnily, the piece I'm reading about here is actually about the region, the Jøtaelv and the region nearby, where I live, which was used to be part of Norway. And they comment that there was a region in Norway containing 5,600 people in an area of 37,500 square kilometers, which amounts to 0.15 persons per square kilometer. That is a... And when they look at the whole population of Norway, medieval Norway, which had an area of about 350,000 square kilometers, it had about 350,000 people. There's just 1 person per square kilometer. Frankly, in some senses, to think about it, giving a 3.5 might be generous. But the military figure seems to be about right. The World of Ice and Fire has revealed that when King Torhin, the king who would come to kneel, gathered his forces, he had time to gather forces to fight the Targaryens. He had time, while the Targaryens went and fought over people, he had time to discuss and consider and call the banners and take his side and bring them down. He had 35,000. I've argued that this is pretty much the whole strength that he could bring, and using the 1% rule, you're looking at about 3.5 million at the time. I don't think it's changed very much in the North. I think other regions may have benefited more from the peace that the Seven Kingdoms brought. But it seems to me that the North is an area that was not at that time known to have been involved in any significant conflicts. And I don't think the North is hospitable enough. I think it's too hit hard by the seasons, by the winters, to be able to sustain a high population density and high growth. So I would say the North, in particular, probably, even though it is about a third the size, the third of the whole of the Seven Kingdoms, it probably is approximately 10% of the population. Nothing to scoff at. But it does have an implication for the novels, which is if you imagine that that there are many thousands more Northmen waiting to fight, that there are, 10, 20, 30,000 more waiting to fight beyond what has already been accounted for in the novels, it's not happening. The only untapped area that we know of really is Skagos. And to a degree, White Harbor seems to have been gathering its strength and not using all of its strength, but it's using a large part of it. I don't imagine that the military strength of the North is in the 50,000. I don't think it's certainly not in the 60,000 area, as some would have it. So that's the very nerdy discussion of the population of the Seven Kingdoms. I would say again, 40 million plus minus 5%. Some people really go far too low. They think, 7 million, and they don't understand how low a population density that is for areas that are too fertile, really, to justify such a low population. There's just no way that the reach is that low in a population. Now, you could rightly ask, why is the Riverland seeming vaguely empty when Arya's wandering around? But you have to imagine that she was deliberately trying, at some point Yoren was deliberately trying to avoid contact with people. She was trying to avoid contact with people. Banners was trying to avoid contact with people. They would stay away from the towns and the strongholds and the places where they might find not a welcome that they were looking for. So, part of this is George's world building not necessarily being as thorough as one might want it to be, or some might. And he probably, I think he does have the idea that cities in Westeros are rare because of the seasonality issue. If you have a long winter, I have to think a city is something of a death trap, unless it's far south, or as with the King's Landing, it's able to command, the resources of the rest of the kingdom to keep it going. Just like the Romans were able to sustain Rome to sort of an inflated size through all the tributes and such they were able to get. So 40 million plus minus. I imagine if you asked George, he wouldn't have any idea. So in the end, it's all just Spanish fan wank, I suppose you might guess. But it's a topic that comes up enough, and that I thought I'd address it. And with that, I am going to leave off this video. Maybe I'll do one quick related video shortly after this. But as I said in our earlier video, we just don't have time right now. We're really busy. We're going to try, but we can't promise anything more or get back to a regular schedule. Maybe, hopefully, after the new year, it'll be a little bit easier and we'll be able to tackle various topics. I know certainly we'd wanted to discuss our essay in Beyond the Wall on the topic of romanticism in the Seven Kingdoms. So with that, I'll sign off. Have a nice evening.